Okay, for those of you who are at our last program, you'll remember that I started the program by saying that I was putting together my introduction. I looked at the introduction from the previous program, and it said, "Thank you for making it out despite the weather." This seems to be an ongoing theme. Apparently, modernist architecture brings rain. Nonetheless, thank you all for making it out despite the bad weather. This is the final program in our four-part series that will explore Metro Boston and the modernist movement. This program will explore essentially the future of modernism, or what to do with the buildings that were built now that they're all approaching 50 years of age. We've been very pleased in this project to be working with the Concord Museum in Docomomo, New England in producing these programs, and would also like to thank the editors and authors of the book Heroic who have helped us organize the series. Just for a little plug, the book is available in the lobby if you haven't bought it yet. It is a fabulous publication, so I would highly encourage people to do so. I'll give a brief introduction to the moderator for the program, who will do the rest of the introductions. Our moderator tonight is Mark Pasnik. He is an associate professor of architecture at the Wentworth Institute of Technology and has taught previously at the California College of Arts, Carnegie Mellon University, Northeastern University, and the Rhode Island School of Design. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Thank you. For me, it's a really great honor to be up here in front of all of you. There's some really distinguished guests in the audience, including Michael McKinnell, a little bit of a hero of mine. And a number of heroes of mine on the table in front of you as well, who are really wonderful people at shaping the preservation movement here in Boston and beyond, and who've been participating in really rethinking the way we consider our architecture for quite a long time. I feel a little bit like a Johnny-come-lately to this topic. These guys have been doing the real heavy lifting for many years. We have two founders of Docomomo, New England here. We have two fellows of the American Institute of Architects and three really great leading architects and writers in the preservation movement. So it's great to be able to gather these people together and talk about this important issue. Instead of reading normal bios, I thought I would actually say something about my own perception of each of these three people. So David Fixler, in the distance here, you're in trouble. David is a principal at EYP, and I think of him as the connector. I first encountered David in Helsinki at a Docomomo International Conference. And from the moment I got there, he was a mysterious figure that people were talking about was arriving. And eventually, he connected me into a whole group of people at a wonderful dinner, many of whom work at the Getty and other really interesting institutions. And so he's had that role really as a person who I think has connected many people. Even just this past couple of weeks, I've been working on the City Hall plan for the future of City Hall. He's been connecting that team to many organizations and processes. So David's really been a wonderful connector in the preservation community. In the middle here, Henry Moss, who's been a longtime advisor of the work I've been doing at Wentworth Institute with students, looking at the Government Service Center. I think of him, I can't help but think of Mass MoCA and my first experience of going there, a building which he worked on many, many years ago, and which, you know, to this day, still, every time I go there is a profound revelation of what preservation can be, not just as something that places something in a past era, but actually revitalizes and makes things new again in a new way. And Henry is a principal at Bruner, Cott and Associates. And then to my immediate left is Ann Beha. Ann Beha is the founder of Ann Beha Architects, and I think my first encounter with you was your building at your reading room at the Christian Science Center, and really it opened a whole new world to me, something that I had no idea existed, and suddenly became a part of the street and the activation of the street. And again, if we think about these modes of preservation, the connections, the opening up, the renewing, I think these are really inspirational ways in which these people have led our community and inspired myself and my colleagues to do something about this particular moment. They also have touched so many architects' work, and this is just a partial list of some of the buildings and architects from the mid-century in particular that these three architects have been involved with in renewing their work or transforming their work in some way, and it's a pretty remarkable list of people. So I thought I'd start off with a few comments based on the work I've been doing with Heroic and with students, and maybe these are some questions that might come up in terms of my own thinking about this, and then each one of the architects next to me will present a brief presentation followed by some discussion and then a chance for you guys to ask some questions. So that's the format for tonight. With that said, the book Heroic, which Gavin mentioned, is something that started for us with Mayor Menino's call to tear down or sell Boston City Hall. So it began at the very beginning of it, was a project about preservation, but maybe not preservation in traditional ways. We were all asked to work with Gerhard and Michael and talk to them and then propose maybe radical or changing solutions so that instead of the decision being between Menino's desire to remove City Hall and possible radical transformation, there might have been a series of conversations about how the building could change and adapt to the present moment. This is, I think, one of the questions that I'll want us to get at is the idea of preservation and preservation as a living action versus preservation as a return to a past state. The era of modern architecture also brings another question with it, which is that much of modern architecture is based on already demolition of spaces that preceded it. So modernism comes into being oftentimes with a tabula rasa approach, cutting down fabric and replacing it with a new language. So these buildings that we want to preserve come with extra baggage. They come with baggage of having already participated in a cycle of renewal prior to their existence. And this is another layer of question that I think comes into being. The mid-century moment is also characterized by a resistance to change as well as an embracing of change, and that is reflected in many of the works of architecture. This is an image from Life magazine of potential towers for the Back Bay, and somebody not particularly happy about that change. But I think this is something that we face today, is a question about what buildings should be preserved and how they might evolve in that same moment. So Heroic has documented a number of these buildings from the mid-century, really from the 60s and early 70s, particularly concrete buildings. That's been our focus in Boston, and looking at them and trying to record their legacy and their importance. And I think one of the again, a kind of question that's unique to this particular moment in architectural history is their public perception as well. And so restoring or preserving a 19th century building is a very different thing than doing that for a mid-20th century building because of the perception of its value, whether it's seen positively or negatively. I've personally been in the plaza of City Hall where duckboat tours go by and say this is the ugliest structure in the world or whatever it is, that there's a kind of received narrative of negativity towards a lot of the concrete architecture in the city. Even to the point where, and I've shown this image before with others, where the word monstrosity in Google Dictionary includes 2 references to concrete architecture in its very first definition. So how do we combat that kind of misperception of the value of these buildings or that kind of negativity towards the value of these buildings in terms of how we preserve them? The challenge also has been very clear in the last decade or so, with a number of buildings being destroyed from this era. This is Prentice Hospital in Chicago, Orange County in Goshen, New York, the Third Church in Washington, and the Mechanic Theater in Baltimore, all being either irrevocably altered or destroyed and replaced by what I think are fairly insubstantial buildings, buildings which don't have any of the civic presence of their originators. The same questions have arisen in our own neighborhoods, the MLK School, or in the future, the Government Center Garage, and the Lincoln House by Mary Otis Stevens, all of which have either been destroyed or are slated to be destroyed to be replaced by a different language altogether. With all of that as a kind of set of questions and background, I've been working with students at Wentworth to look at the Government Service Center. Henry's been closely involved, and David was also involved in certain phases of it as well, looking at activating the minds of students as to how they might react to or transform or look for a new kind of future for a building like this. So we've worked with students, and again, this is a very complicated building because it's incomplete, because it's in a pretty bad state of repair, and also because of some of the design decisions that were made early on by Paul Rudolph, its architect, that aren't, let's say, particularly friendly towards the city around them. And so there's some real challenges to the building at the same time that many of us see it as a highly valuable building and a really wonderful recording of a legacy of a particular moment. So to what extent should this be preserved as is, transformed, made better, demolished? These are the kinds of questions that a building like this will face in the future. So we worked with many people from DCAM, the owners of the building, and you see one of the DCAM representatives in the middle, a student on the right side, and on the left is James McNeely, who is the project architect under Paul Rudolph. Actually, he worked for Desmond and Lord, the sister firm, but he was the project architect for this building. It was really wonderful to get that first-hand view of his experience working on this building in the 1960s. We met with lots of people, involved a lot of organizations, and started to assess the building, and then eventually came to analysis of the building, trying to understand. It's a very, very complicated and rich work of architecture. And then eventually students proposed a series of alternative lives for the building, that it would be preserved on some level, but it would be transformed as well, looking for new uses that might complement the existing, new ways of re-envisioning it, giving it new ecological presence, for instance, kind of sustainability initiatives, new kinds of functions that might support a more active place. And in essence, trying to return back to the aspirations of the building rather than its formal characteristics. The aspirations were to make a real destination in the heart of nearby the West End. The same questions arise very much with Boston City Hall, which is a project that I'm a historical advisor to the current planning process, which is looking at the future of this building, what to preserve, what to save, what to transform, what possibilities exist. And you know, it is a building that, again, like many of these buildings, had a long history. This is, you can see Michael in a few years ago in the second one from the left. You know, it's a building that has sparked controversy from its very beginning, and that I think has also sparked inspiration from its very beginning. You know, it's a building around which a lot of passion has been developed, both for and against the building, and we've seen that in our conversations. But it's one which has also inherited a kind of dark cloud around it. You know, in Black Mass, it's the FBI headquarters. In a Droid ad, it's this sort of terrible dystopian future. And yet, when you know more about the building, you understand its original aspirations were really utopian, and we need to kind of return back to that kind of sensibility. These are the words of Michael McKinnell a few years later and Gerhard Kallman, talking about the building as a process that would engage successive generations of the citizenry in the embellishment, decoration, and adornment of the robust armature that we had designed. And for me, this is the kind of essence of preservation, is not necessarily to preserve the form as it was, but to preserve some of this inspiring idea that this could be actually a better building. It was never really embellished in the way that the architects originally conceived, and that we've been shortchanging the aspirations of the building, and that we can return to that kind of concept as well as to some sense of preservation of the object itself. And I'll leave you with this last image, which Joyce Linehan, if anybody knows her, she's the chief of policy for the city of Boston. Just a few days ago, she sent Michael Kubo, Chris Grimley, and myself, the co-authors of Heroic, she sent us this photo on Facebook about how a year ago that date, Michael McKinnell had visited with the mayor. And you know, I think if I started this process with you know, the mayor talking about tearing down this building, we're ending this process, or maybe beginning a new process, with the mayor embracing this building and embracing you know, the vision behind it. And I think that, for me, bodes quite well And I'm starting to see a shift in culture around this type of building. So for me, I have very much many questions for these guys and many optimisms to share. So with that, I'm going to switch over to David Fixler, who's going to present on his work.
Yeah, as close as you can get that would be appreciated, but you had me there for a second.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, hard act to follow. Mark has given a tremendous introduction. About 5 years ago, I wrote an article for the inaugural issue of a journal called Change Over Time, which is a critical preservation journal. And in that, I sort of concluded it with these 5 points about the renewal of modernism. And I thought it might be nice to sort of refresh those, and not really knowing where all of this was going to go, to put the work that I'm going to be showing very briefly tonight in the context of these 5 points. And the 5 points are, I have this, okay. Here we go. First, philosophy. Second, language or style. Third, partnering with industry. Fourth, addressing failure. And fifth, sustainability. They may not seem to be sort of all in the same relational issues, but there are very good reasons why I picked that. And I'm going to start out with the whole idea of philosophy, because I think Mark already has really dived into this subject with the whole idea of preserving idea. And the whole notion of preserving an idea is something that goes back at least to the founding of Docomomo in 1988, and has really sort of persisted through all of the work that people have done in working with modern buildings. And I show here the very nicely restored Zonnestraal Sanatorium in Hilversum in the Netherlands, restored by Wessel de Jong, one of the founders of Docomomo. And the reason this is an interesting philosophical statement, because this is a building that was never meant to last. It was an ephemeral building to begin with, and yet we've put tremendous resources into preserving it, into, in effect, making it permanent. And the idea is there here, this was, and it was also more or less in a ruinous state when this was undertaken. So part of this is not so much about the traditional Western idea of conserving historic fabric, or pieces of the True Cross, as my partner Matt Shalif, who characterizes it, but really about the idea of this, because very little of what you see there is the original building. Most of it has been recreated in order to give you this thing which, in the minds of a purist, may be a simulacrum, but it's a very beautiful and very wonderful and very vivid and living idea of what this building is, even though it isn't exactly the original thing. And I carried this through, there's this carrying through now into the first of my own projects that I'm going to show. And pardon to those who have seen me do this many times over the last 15 years, but I worked on Alvarado's Baker House in the late 90s and early aughts. And this to me was a very defining project, because here the issue, there are two issues that come up here. One that really is the first and the second. And that really is first about the idea of the philosophy. And in this case, one of the things that distinguishes modern architecture is we know so much about it. As opposed to working with older buildings where there's often limited records of what's there. We know more than we want to know about how these buildings came to be, what the architect's thought process was. In many cases, you can interview the people who worked on it. In this case, I interviewed Aalto's assistants. Aalto himself was dead. But one of the things that comes apparent is there are things that were intended to be that never were, and say, okay, so philosophically, do you put them in and engage in what my fellow panelist here has called seance architecture, or do you say, no, we're being strict constructionists, we're not going to do that? Well, I think the interesting thing with both of this idea with the trellises on this side and on the other side, the idea of changing the material of what is a stucco wall on that cascading stair to the original tile. It was interesting how much the architectural historians and architectural community embraced that idea, whereas, of course, the preservationists recoiled in horror. Now, in the end, after much looking at this and a lot of philosophical debate, and you see we had all this information. We had the shop drawings for the tile that was going to go up there, but it never did. In the end, it was stucco. And in the end, we decided to stay with the stucco for reasons of pragmatism, but also for reasons that the contractor in the first place didn't want to put the tile up, which was that technically it was a very questionable system. But I think what it brings out is that when you're dealing with this level of information, you're asked to make a lot of choices, a lot of very seductive options may appear to you, and there is no right or wrong. The important thing is to engage your client your stakeholders, the larger design community in discussing these issues to sort of see what really is the best way to address the thing. So it's a very important thing. Then you also get into the issue of language, because so much of what we do today looks like modern architecture, even though philosophically it may not be what modern architecture was 50 or 60 years ago. And do we want to make this distinction? How careful do we want to be, especially in an iconic building like Baker House, to carry out when you have to make changes, as we did? These happens to be drawings of the dining room in Baker House, and they indicate both a railing design and a ceiling design that were never executed, but that in fact we had good reason to try to implement in our renovation. And what we did in the end is we took the ceiling, because the ceiling, it solved so many technical problems. We said, all right, we're going to do that. We're going to do it literally. We're going to do it in a way that we think Aalto would do it. But then when we looked at the railing, which had to be changed for code reasons, we decided, no, what he originally proposed was not the right way to do it. We're going to do an interpretive hybrid, make it work using parts of the original building on its own terms and not worrying about being faithful to his original intent, and try to, again, come up with the best hybrid solution. We hope it works. A very interesting example of this plays out in the work that I did at the United Nations, and this is the Trusteeship Council chamber, which was donated by the Danish government, one of the three major chambers you may be familiar with. It's the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, and the Security Council. This room was originally designed by Finn Yule, and in doing the renovation, actually, the Danes decided that they would hold an internal competition in Denmark for the refurbishment of this room, and we sort of stepped back and said, okay, we'll help you carry out whatever it is you decide to do. And what was very interesting about this is we posited the idea of going back, and if you, the three diagrams there on the lower left is the original Trusteeship Council chamber in black and white. Just above that is the chamber as it was until we renovated it a few years ago, and then on the right is the finished product. And it's a little hard to see, but the finished product and the original have more or less the same kind of seating layout, even though we had to more than double the number of seats. What happened in the interim is it became much more of a tiered sort of stadium kind of seating rather than something in a horseshoe shape. So we wanted to get this intimacy back. The Danes were all in favor of that. But they wanted to reinvent what the classic United Nations delegates table, which you find in every room in the building, and come up with their own idea. And I think what they've come up with here is a wonderful idea of, okay, how do we express a way to carry modernism forward into something that is clearly contemporary, because you would never mistake that desk for a 1950 desk, but still blends with it harmonizes with the room and kind of shows the way in which this can be intelligently evolved as part of the design. So again, I think this was a very successful collaboration, but again, also subject to a tremendous amount of debate. And frankly, UNESCO stepped in and said, you know, we sure this is the right thing to do. It was a very, I think, an enlightening experience for everyone involved. I've been working on the two Saarinen buildings at MIT, the Kresge Auditorium and the chapel. And here's where I want to talk just very briefly here about partnering with industry. Both in this project and in the next project I will show you after this, we've been working on glazing assemblies to make both the entry to the chapel, which is an art glass little bridge, right? If I can do it here. There it is. And the more robust, and then also the curtain walls to Kresge here. So what we've been looking at for all of these buildings, and I'm about to indulge in a fourth one, is the idea that these are monolithically glazed structures. Typically, they're 1/8 or 1/4-inch plate glass. And we want a way to make them both more robust from a safety standpoint and from an energy standpoint, but we absolutely don't want to change their appearance. So we've spent a lot of time working with our partners in industry, doing a sort of design assist with people in the glass and curtain wall industry to develop details that really work with this, so that you can keep the appearance, but in some subtle way, like in this case at Kresge, where we had to change the aluminum channel to stainless steel because just the material properties make the stainless steel just stronger enough that we didn't have to change any of the structure behind it to support the heavier weight of the glass we use, because the glass we changed from 1/8-inch plate to a laminated glass, which both gives us better security and better energy efficiency. There's a very good reason why you don't go to an insulated glazing unit in something like this. First of all, they require a much deeper glazing pocket. And the second is, there are really three in my mind. The second is that it's almost impossible to get it to read as flat as the original polished plate glass. And the third is, from a sustainability standpoint, believe it or not, you do have to replace them at some point, whereas laminated glass is more or less a permanent solution. So here at Kresge, this is something that looks virtually the same as what was there before. The only real difference is the fact that the glass is thicker and heavier, and it is supported by stainless steel now instead of aluminum, which makes up that property. Whereas at the chapel, we actually worked with a special laminating process with a German company that gives you a liquid laminate in order to take this very uneven art glass, laminate it to another piece of uneven non-art glass, but just clear glass. And I would challenge anyone to look at that and know that this is actually a laminated assembly rather than just the original glass. And we were able to conserve the original glass in this instance. But we also, in the spirit of full disclosure, we had to completely rebuild these frames because they had rotted out. We rebuilt the carbon steel and stainless steel to give it a more permanent solution. But this is the purest kind of restoration example that I will show you. The other thing we did is we looked at the possibility of putting vestibules in Kresge Auditorium. I want to reassure you, we never actually built this. Please remember, we never built this. But we did want to prove to, MIT wanted us to prove to them that it was possible to build something that was as diaphanous and minimal as possible. And again, in order to get to that is not something you can do without very, very close collaboration from industry partners. But fortunately, we are not putting these in. The last example I want to show you here is the Louis Kahns Richards Labs at the University of Pennsylvania, where we just finished the first phase of the renovation of this. There's 2 towers of the 4, and developed design guidelines for the rest. And again, we're going to focus here on the partnering with industry and on the glazing system. Very, very similar to the issues that we faced at Kresge, but on a completely different scale because you're dealing with pieces of glass that are 15 by 5.5 feet big. And you're also dealing with an incredibly elegant glazing system, a system which, I'll get to that. Yeah, here we go. A system which was developed by Kahn first in a building just before this in Philadelphia and used throughout his career. It's not something he ever spoke a lot about. But it is a bent stainless steel section, and it's one of the most incredibly elegant glazing sections you'll ever see. Its only fatal flaw in today's world is that it does not have a thermal break, but we're working on that. Suffice to say, what we did do with this is, again, for reasons of dimension and strength, developed a very high-performance laminated glass, had a very long process with both a curtain wall consultant and with industry partners to make sure we got something that not only looked right, and looking right is a National Historic Landmark, looking right was of paramount importance, but fit within this extremely narrow glazing pocket. And we would spend an hour on the phone talking about a 16th of an inch. I mean, it got down to that point. But in the end, it was successfully glazed. And here are the 3 options. You can see on the left the original. On the center, a shot at actually doing an insulated glass unit because we had to prove to Penn that you could do it, but you really didn't want to. And then on the right, the solution that we ended up with, which was the high-performance laminate. And in combination with the changes to the building systems, one of the things that we discovered with this is people are very, very concerned about high-performing building envelopes. But when we looked at really where the energy use was coming in this building, we made a good incremental improvement in the building envelope, but we made a far, far better improvement in the system, changing over the VAV system to a chilled beam system, and really dramatically reduced the energy use in the building systems. And part of that was enabled, quite frankly, by changes in program that went from a wet lab more to a computational lab. So another lesson of this that we like to say, and that's put on some of this, is that you repurpose to accommodate the building when you're dealing with an iconic building very often. You can't always do that. And here in the end is this sort of the integration of what we did. There's a very interesting architectural story that goes with this too, about opening up the floors and about realizing Kahn's vision of what he wanted this building to be, which was very open and studio-like, and it never come to fruition. But I'll save that for another day. But you can see how the overlaying of the systems, which were all exposed in this space, are also a very important critical visual aspect to doing this. And again, the idea of partnering with industry, working very, very closely with chilled beam manufacturers, with the HVAC contractors, and with a lot of third parties to make sure that what we intended to put above the ceiling was going to look the right way. And a couple of views of the finished space before the furnishing. There on the left, an original construction photo from when in 1961, and then on the right our space, and then the finished space today. One of the things we had to do was to, in order to meet the space standards, was to devise a way to put a layer of glass behind this and make the offices smaller. And again, it's a longer story than I'm able to tell right now, but I think it's a very interesting lesson, again, in the things one sometimes has to do with a very rigid building to soften its rigidity and to come to terms with it in a way that perhaps would not be as evident in other structures of this kind. We did develop design guidelines. This is a typical section from that just shows how looking at the layering of the systems and how that all worked into the space. And then just I'm going to close on the notes of sustainability, because one of the biggest issues that the United Nations was facing was the fact that it has to stand as a symbol for sustainable economic development and a sustainable future for our planet. So obviously everything needed to be done to make this as sustainable as possible. And this is just a matrix of some of the many things that were done to this building to improve its thin envelope, to improve its systems, to improve water usage, and to look at a whole wide range, an array of things that one might do with a building like this to try to meet the sustainability goals that we're all trying to achieve. It's not often so easy with these buildings. It's not simply a matter of insulating the exterior walls. As I said, very often it's the systems that give you more of that. But nonetheless, it is very much a goal that we all need to continue to strive for. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse. And one of the things that we wanted to do on this building was to put a photovoltaic array on the General Assembly. In the end, that did not come about, but I wanted to show you a building at the Vatican of the same vintage and by Pierluigi Nervi of a very similar form to the General Assembly, where they have done just that. And that is, in fact, entirely, all of the interior lighting and power for that building comes from that photovoltaic array. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Were you able, from a sustainability point of view, able to persuade the French not to smoke in your building?
Yes. It took a good 5 years, but yes. Yes.
A note or two just about Mark, Chris, and Michael's book, Heroic, is after you buy it, upon your departure, I would urge you to begin by reading the interviews. And one of the interesting elements to me was Michael McKennell's comment about Jose Luis Sert and how he'd been an attractive example in terms of the scale of his work with campuses in American local American colleges at an urban scale to Michael and his partners. It's interesting to me that Sert had an enormous impact on the skyline of Boston and Cambridge, and I think an enormous impact on people's thinking as architects and planners, urban designers who followed through his educational influence, and not a very big influence on architectural history. If you look at what modern architecture was in America from the point of view of a Londoner, you have to search to find Sert. But you also have to search to find H.H. Richardson. There are national parochialisms that are intriguing to me. But he in particular, Sert, had an interesting background. I think he was from a minor royalty in Spain. He was as a student, he demonstrated quite a lot of leadership, thought leadership, brought Le Corbusier to Barcelona to help him with his teaching, amongst other students, worked in Le Corbusier's office, and then I think it was 37. People here will have to correct me on my dates throughout this little talk. 1937, there was an exposition in Paris, and Sert did the Spanish Pavilion. And it was a strong modernist statement. They commissioned a mural by a man named Pablo Picasso. During the period of the construction of this exhibit, the bombing of Guernica took place. They erased or painted over what Picasso was doing, put up a new canvas, that was Guernica, and all of you, I'm sure, have seen it in the Museum of Modern Art, and Sert brought it here. Sert's association with the anti-fascist elements meant that it was impossible for him to return to France, from France to Spain. So he ended up in the United States, and through a search for a new dean in the 1950s, because he was practicing from Long Island, it's hard to really track the story to its roots, but I think that people wanted Oscar Niemeyer to come to Harvard, but he was a declared member of the Communist Party in Brazil. And this was the McCarthy era. So Sert was brought instead. And furthermore, he had a tremendous background because of his work with the Congress of International Modern Architecture. Say it in French, and it turns out SIAM. He brought with him the resolution to decades of argument within the Harvard Graduate School of Design about the relationship between planning and architecture. And he had, and this is something that will come up a couple of times, what Sert did that I think very few other architects have done is he brought a commitment to a train of thought that went from the urban scale or even regional scale right down to interior design. And there was a consistency and a fluidity of thought or rigidity of thought that encompassed this enormous spectrum of architectural problems and solutions. And when you look at I.M. Pei or Mies van der Rohe or even Paul Rudolph, in spite of his grandiosity or even megalomania, I think it's hard to say that they did the same thing. And I don't think Sert has received sufficient credit for that. So when I go back to the statement in Heroic about how his campus designs were inspirational, what I'm interested in is, and I keep struggling with this, I can't quite track it down. What was it about the modernist architecture of the 1950s that so captured and in fact inflamed the imagination of trustees, overseers, and presidents of major universities? How did that optimism become so powerful that it could generate so much construction? And then why did it disappear so fast? So I have a couple of thoughts. I was very interested to find that in 1966, Nathan Pusey, who was already an important person because of his opposition to McCarthy, was addressing the AIA National Convention. And he doesn't talk about a new architecture. He said the needed new man in architecture. And it's a pretty, incidentally, the image under this is a studio image from Sert's classes in urban design at the Graduate School of Design, in which he visualized 3 versions of Holyoke Center marching down Massachusetts Avenue and Harvard Square. People don't talk about that much, but we know that those studies were done and that the form, the planning concept and the setbacks and so forth, and the scale maneuvers at Holyoke Center all came from these studies. Thank God he did one. It's not that, and it would be worth talking to Charlie Sullivan later about this, it's not that campus expansion had not been an issue in the past. And there were these enormous sweeping changes along, for example, the Harvard riverfront, the Charles River. And Charlie told me last week that I think 1,400 parishioners from St. Peter, St. Paul's, were basically moved out of that area as the expansion of Harvard student housing, almost the creation of it, but in volume, moved along that area. And if you look, though, at what it is, it's a series of quadrangles that reinforce cultural continuity symbolically with enormous power. So you have a piece of the New York City Hall, a piece of Independence Hall, and so on and so forth. These are very powerful affirmations of a continuity of culture in the United States. By contrast, what you have in the lower corner here is Sert trying to look at the whole arena of walkways and vehicular pathways through the portion of Cambridge that is occupied by Harvard, and that he projected to be further occupied by Harvard. So that he's looking at how you get from the Radcliffe, the quadrangle, Radcliffe Quad, across Cambridge Common, back through the area of the law school. He, in this diagram, shows the overpass next to the law school that takes you from the Science Center into Harvard Yard, and then takes you through to his arcade at Holyoke Center, then with this bizarre notion that somehow he's going to demolish everything between there and the river. He did not. So I think the break with a hideous past, World War I, Depression, World War II, the iconoclasm that was associated with the optimism of this new movement was incredibly powerful. But it wasn't shared by everyone. This is a straightforward quote from Jose Luis Sert. He's leaving Harvard Yard and looking at Massachusetts Avenue. A few steps away, there's a gateway that opens onto Harvard Square, and like Dante's door to hell, could carry over it the inscription, "Abandon all hope," meaning all hope of finding these elements that make our environment human, because across the gate is noise, disorder, lack of visual balance and harmony. And I think it's that straightforward, that as the new buildings and campus plans began to be built, people understood that it was a statement that was going to wipe away much of the cultural continuity on which their identities really depended. So when you look at this series of photographs, there is a tremendous difference symbolically. There's also a tremendous difference in terms of reality. What Pusey was saying was that the time had come to abandon an ad hoc, one building, one quadrangle, one renovation for a department at a time as the solution to campus expansion problems. I'm going to show in a moment a photograph of an aerial photograph of the BU campus. And I know that and Wendy may be able to help us here, there's some background where I think people cannot imagine how painful the parcel by parcel accumulation of land to create the campus of Boston University was over the decades. But in any case, at a certain point, Kennedy and Tip O'Neill told President Marsh that they were going to have to build up. So this on your screen is really the first big urban integration high-rise associated with a university or a college. And it had an elegance that's been swept away by a number of attempts to make it feel somehow more human. This 1960s photograph of the corner where the Cambridge Savings, or the Cambridge Trust Company was. Charlie, it's your bank, you may remember it, but there was an elegance and a transparency there that we have lost in attempts to make the building somehow more colorful. The sustainability issues that David talked about were really acute. By 1979, the remnants of Sert's office were doing plans for recladding this building from the interior in order to get rid of its huge energy costs. It was a much more colorful building and a much more interesting one to look at that time than it turned out to be when our friends Phyllis Cholinsky tried to enliven it as a retail destination for people of Cambridge. On your left-hand screen is an image I adore. It's part of As hallucinatory as the optimism about the future was, this is a hallucination about the past, superimposed on the 1925 fundraising document for Boston University. What no one really imagined is that this imagery and its affect would have its throat cut by Storrow Drive, which of course had been legislated out of possibility. What you see on the right is finally BU got it together enough to get Cram's buildings built by Shepley, and the area behind them is now truncated, cut away from the river. Storrow Drive is under construction, and there's this ribbon of campus potential. One of Sert's students won a competition for the student center, student union at Boston University. He took it to Sert and said, I don't know how to build a building. Can you help me with this? Why don't I become kind of a partner and we'll do this together? Sert said, sure. Went to the campus, they got started, and he went to then President Case and said, can I see your plans for how you intend to expand into this campus? And they had none, but none. So Sert, uninvited, put together this plan. And one of the things that interests me about this period is that buildings like Holyoke Center and this barrage of towers and low buildings were frequently done as sculptural massing circulation diagrams without having any program. Holyoke Center was confirmed as a project by the Corporation of Harvard University on the basis that they find a use for it. And some years later, they moved the infirmary into it, and they began to build 5 stories. Halfway through the construction, they were authorized to go to 10. They built the first phase from Mount Auburn Street up to the back of a building, one of the ones that he was complaining about in that quote. And then he lived for some time not knowing if that building was going to be completed, taken out to Massachusetts Avenue. So the amazing thing is that half of this plan was constructed within 6 years. So I think you can recognize from this the tower, which was built for the School of Law and the School of Education. Didn't quite have enough program to fill the tower, so he piled one on top of the other. Needed a law library. There's one of those. This is the Pappas Law Library, and then the Mugar Library is over to your right. The strange thing is that he thought the circulation was going to work somehow, people filtering from Back Bay along the river, and that there would be a new facade and a new front for Boston University. Well, that never turned out to be the case. So as in many of these buildings, a fire exit turns out to be the main entrance to that tower, for example. We were brought in by, so the School of Law needs to expand. It needs to get a lot bigger, and they price new buildings on other sites, and those don't work out financially. The disturbance and disruption is something that the university can't quite figure out how to do. They tear down, BU tears down the armory. They hire Wendy and Candy Jenkins to figure out where they really stand in terms of historic buildings. And thank you, you noted that the Sert buildings had some significance. So a very interesting thing that I think is emblematic of the way architects and particularly owners first respond to buildings of this type, and that is to cancel them. If you want a new program, you write down the opposites of the characteristics of the inherited buildings and stand back and say, that's what we're going to do. So in this case, the proposal was to enclose this building with a blue glass curtain wall and to build a long horizontal element across its frontage at the river. The BRA sweet-talked BU into thinking differently, and we were then brought in to do a preservation plan. And talking to BU, we suggested that that was really not going to serve their interests. What they needed, instead of a list of guidelines about what not to do and what to do, is a development plan associated with preservation guidelines. They said, oh, okay. So crudely, we put together this series of statements, and as you can imagine, those don't really begin to generate a blue glass curtain wall. We did begin to educate a very resistant campus population, and I'll talk about the varieties within that in a moment, about what the characteristics were in the design that was there that are worth keeping. And in many instances, people had never paid attention to the way this building goes all the way to the ground, that there's a levitated upper floor all the way through the campus. Sert was able to do that frequently with a projection of only 3 feet compared to the lengths that we sometimes go to. And generally, though, unlike Mark Pasnik, they don't like the buildings because they're made of concrete. But there's another issue there. Buildings go through periods like other fashions, go through periods of becoming unfashionable. After about 30 to 35 years, their mechanical systems have begun to fail. They no longer comply with the building codes. And if they are of a stylistic grouping that people don't love automatically, if it's not a simulacrum of an ionic column building, it becomes an architecture without architects. Basically, the facilities department is given the building. So if there's any maintenance, and frequently there's very little, it can be very destructive. So this is the Pappas Library. And on the left, you can see this bright, inviting front that Sert developed. And on the right, you see what happened when the facilities department decided they were going to go down to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy a more efficient window with completely different system of proportions. Look below. On the left is what Sert had given them, and look at the right. So imagine that you're a student, body coming through there, transitioning every 4 years. What you think Jose Luis Sert is producing is that building that's on the right. And it's extraordinary how depressing those moves can be, just one at a time. I think that I gave a talk years ago, and Albert Rex from the Boston Preservation Alliance came up to me and said, "Is there a book I can read?" The roots of historic preservation in the 60s and 70s came from resistance to buildings of this type. And as a result, in many instances, people were not giving them the chance to look at them, think about them, and react both critically and appreciatively. And there are plenty of things to criticize about these buildings. Generally, they meet the ground very poorly, and as David has already mentioned, there are geometry problems that are really significant. The ceilings are generally too low. The spaces are generally too compressed horizontally. I.M. Pei's green building at MIT was built for labs. It's now too small. This building was extremely difficult to alter in ways that would accommodate any new social spaces or a library. I think the compositional issues here, where you have a big, simple volume, then with arrays of repetitive elements, which are quite sculptural, extremely sophisticated stylistically, and extremely unsophisticated in terms of a building envelope and its performance. This is the building under construction, kind of crude. You can see even here in this image, the spalling of these fins, the concrete that is breaking up where reinforcing steel is too close to the surface. Windows were actually falling out and spiraling down to the ground in emulation of the Hancock Tower. I think David and I can both say that we have been tremendously supported by Simpson, Gumpert's, and Hager's technical staff in finding solutions to glazing and to the laboratory matching of concrete mixes, for example. And it is so much more complicated than doing an ordinary stone or brick building. It's almost indescribable, particularly since in order to get the match right for concrete, you have to wait until it cures, and it doesn't match, and then you wait again. So before you know it, you're in a cycle of month-long delays in making decisions. And it's sometimes not easy to get your client to start that 2 years early. But these buildings can change. We took a concern I had in confronting the preservation orthodoxies was that the Mass Historical Commission was going to not let us remove and replace defective elements, but was going to have us repair them. And in many instances, it's much easier, simpler, and better to take away concrete fins, which have reinforcement too near the front, and put in a new one. We replaced all the windows. We replaced all of these mad vent panels. There was no air conditioning in the building. What Sert thought was, okay, I'll give everybody a sort of casement door. They can open it up and wind will blow through it. In fact, with the changes that we made here, were very much the same active chilled beams that the mechanical system carried the load. On the other hand, there's the building with all of its windows out. One thing about that I find exciting about the architectural challenge is bringing the old and the new together in ways that are a combined work. And I like to do that with a fair amount of friction, so that people have to still recognize what was there before. And we did that in this interior. The facade components are pretty much look the way they did when Sert did it. As David also mentioned, making decisions about the very specific characteristics of glass are critical. And when you put in 2 layers of glass where there had previously been 1, it tends to go greener. So we also shifted the colors slightly to make them stronger in Sert's vent panels. Incidentally, Sert wanted to do a tutti frutti 5-color system splashed all over the building randomly, originally. President Case said, no, pick 1 or 2. So he picked 2. There were a lot of modernist elements that were bitten back even during this period. The geometry issues and the scale of new programmatic requirements by the universities for these buildings, and the fact that in many instances they meet the ground quite badly from their origin, leads to demolition. These are 2 images from 3 images. One is of an interior space and one is of the exterior of that space along Holyoke Street, where we're taking down a retail block to put back a large interior space for Holyoke Center. And we worked and worked and worked to see if we could somehow deal with the existing sectional requirements or the constraints of the buildings. We never could. The important thing then as a design challenge, and we are doing this as executive architects for Hopkins Architects in London, is to find a new language that actually works well with the old and makes its statement unapologetically. So that leads to one kind of final note, which is that preservation in many instances through the past has been such a defensive movement with urban renewal and unregulated development from an architectural point of view. In fact, a lot of very clumsy modernism through the 70s and 80s that I think we've become quite defensive. And instead, what I would recommend is that we look at St. Peter's as an example, speaking of the philosophies, and that is that there is a layering from one generation to the next in which these buildings are seen, understood, criticized, respected, criticized again, and then altered. And then the next generation is going to do something else. Thank you. Bramante, Michelangelo, Bernini,
Nervy.
Fixler, Nervy.
Well, I agree, Henry. I think it is a new dimension of architectural practice and of urban planning to consider the buildings from our recent past. And there are different urgencies and attitudes that shape the way we choose to either preserve them or change them. So I am going to talk a little bit about how we encounter these buildings in everyday life, and then how we intervene with them in order to make them fruitful for their users, some of whom don't like them at all. So I'm still in Cambridge here because as pedestrians, it's important to know where to find these special treats. And I take the case that individually they're very important, perhaps, but also as an ensemble or precinct when they occur, the pedestrian in all of us gets this kind of fruitful encounter with them that makes us really think about what's important. and what they say, and why they all seem to say something very different to each other, or sometimes don't even care about each other, or you. So let's take a couple of looks here. This is Cambridge just to the right. The yard is in the middle. You see all the green space. And then let's look at this region that includes Sert's 1972 Science Building. It includes John Andrews Gund Hall, 1972. It includes Minoru Yamasaki's William James Hall. It includes, in this case, I put 2 buildings by Henry Cobb in. It also includes the Carpenter Center, Catalano's Cambridge Rindge and Latin School, and of course, the latest in the region, which is the Fogg Museum by Renzo Piano. So if you want to do a lap, this is on close inspection, a part of Cambridge where you can see a great deal. And you can look on the outside and on the inside and absorb buildings that largely have not been changed. But as Henry and David have said, they are, many of them, on the edge of change simply because they have so long had uses or technologies that are substandard for today's or technologies essentially, and characteristics that are substandards for the needs we have today. So just quickly, here they are, and here's the galaxy of people who brought them to you. And I appreciate very much, Henry, you're delving into Sert's story. And if you look at Sert, Catalano, who is from Argentina, Le Corbusier, who's Swiss, French, Yamasaki, Asian American architect, and Jim Sterling, British, every one of these architects had a story about how the building happened, who controlled its design, and in some cases, the Giuliani absolutely detested the building. This is a Menino kind of story, and he really encouraged it to be completely reconsidered. And this is that building today. And I just leave it to you. I also am very fascinated by the work of Beluski, because one of the buildings I worked on was 1932 Portland Art Museum, one of Beluski's first projects in the United States. And here is his work for the Juilliard School, built in the early 70s. And of course, by 10 years ago, it was up for complete renovation by Diller Scofidio. And now I find it an incredibly exciting urban solution, very successful, very hard to find the Beluski-ishness in it. The Beluskiano is Capuzco. So interesting that we fold and blend and Cuisinart these buildings into something that relates to what we want today. And on Broadway, with the ballet in that front room and the openness, it sets an example of really this kind of sculpting, this resculpting and reconsideration. So quickly, the 5 men whose work I will visit for a minute are well known to you, many of them, but a couple maybe not so much. Walker Kane, a modernist architect who basically took over the work of McKim, Mead & White and ran their firm. Lucan, Walter Gropius, Edward Durrell Stone, and Pietro Beluschi. And I share in the story that many of them were immigrants. Many of them came to America to escape an oppression. Many of them found America very receptive. Most of them were academics in some ways and had tremendous influence on many, many students and acolytes. And they left us with some fascinating buildings that were born of a very complex adult and childhood life. They just generating the technologies and the ideas was an extremely complex effort for many of them. So going to Portland and starting in 1932 with one of Beluski's first buildings, you can see this kind of restrained, modern approach that he took to the presence of the Portland Art Museum. And internally, we did not change it much. This glass curtain wall is finely developed simply to try to deal with the humidity issues associated with museums and to keep that sense of air and light moving between the galleries. And he has some wonderful gestures in here that were completely restored. Same issues, David, as you had, all the usual headaches about everything to do with mullions and glass. But what we did change was the context in which it's presented. So sometimes you're on the terrain around the building rather than in the building. And this was the landscape in which the building was set as a kind of former street. And this is that same landscape now. It's a sculpture terrace for the museum. And it represents, as you can see on the left, the way the Beluski building hits the ground into this urban center where you pass between two parts of the city because it's open till 11 o'clock at night and becomes an urban landscape rather than simply the domain only of the museum. So below that is a 400-seat film auditorium. So instead of building above grade and adding to the building, this is a more subtle way of intervening and changing the terrain. But I'm going to take you to Washington, where there's some other very interesting stories about mid-century modernism. And one that we're working on right now is the work of Walker Kane. And these are Walker Kane's drawings of the building he wanted to and did design for the Smithsonian, for the National Museum of American History. And you can see they're delicate and almost cute cartoons of the facade. And they include all kinds of studies of the way in which the light and shadow would work. But then the public rendering is Hugh Ferris. And he goes, well, you know, big, muscular, not pretty drawing at all of this imposing building that will be worthy of its site on the mall. One of the only modern buildings that could be built on the mall at that period. And this is the building today. And you can see how contrasting it is with the buildings around it in the other similar eras, just a few decades before buildings that were being built. So the issues of preservation here are complex. They have to do with an interior design which is more terminal-like, airport terminal-like, than it is really like a modern-day museum that immediately engages us with the materials and collections for which this building is so well known. But quite fascinating, stripped-down interior. However, changes have been made. And where that incredibly clean environment existed, this intervention, which was completed about 7 years ago, changes the perception of the space completely. It's effective for moving people and getting families to know where they're going, but it's a big change. And from there, of course, you encounter the amazing moments. But there's really nothing in the kind of cool simplicity of the Walker Kane interior that gets you ready for seeing Julia's kitchen. It's not the gemütlich kind of environment that says, in this museum, you'll experience personal stories and domestic life. So it, as a container, has its own parallel story that's sometimes kind of kicking at what the museum is trying to accomplish. And next to it now is the new National Museum of African American History and Culture by David Adage. It's a fantastic building. I toured it yesterday. Fantastic. But it says something very different back to the building that was built in the 60s by Walker Kane. We become, in Walker Kane's building, the closed building, the repository, the building with no windows. David's building becomes the building that's transparent, the building that's activated, the building that has life at night through this screen. And those two conversations are very challenging. Then I'm going to go to Athens, and I'm probably going to end a little early so you can jump in with some good questions. And the U.S. Embassy in Athens, we were chosen out of their Design Excellence program to do the renovation and expansion of the United States Embassy. And Michael McKinnell's firm had also done an expansion just within a decade ago. It was completed. This is the neighborhood. And I want to take you just to a different sensibility about preservation in this place that is so not Boston. So the U.S. Embassy, you can see here, it was built and conceived as an iconic, monumental, muscular building, clad in marble, with clear references to its antecedents, and with a presence right on the main drag in Athens. So immediately when you see this, you see it surrounded and enveloped in the neighborhood. You see Gropius there. Here's a story. A German is doing the U.S. Embassy in Athens within a decade of the end of World War II. Wake me up. This was complicated. And here he is standing with one of the design leaders from the State Department, and he has some amazing gestures in this building, in the porte cochere, in the kind of nature of the overhangs, in the way it sits on the site, the simplicity of the site, the courtyard itself, all of which added up to it being a major civic landmark used all the time, and today no longer open, but surrounded by security fences. So we change. It's not that the building changes. We change about who we are and what we need from our buildings. And part of our work here, of course, is to consider how not only we restore this building, but how we relate it to the kinds of concerns that Americans abroad have. And it's also on a site now where it's companioned with this Coleman McKinnell building, and it therefore has a kind of campus aspect to it, where we have on the right the Gropius building, much in need of renovation, and on the left, the newer building, quite a lot larger as its companion. So this is the first time I've been able to present a piece of our design work there. One of the things I've learned about working with the State Department is I probably never will present all the design we're doing. But we are joining the two buildings. We're creating a new entry. There's a lot of reasons for that. And we are able, by taking the pressure off the Gropius building, to have very vulnerable uses in it to preserve it. If we have vulnerable uses in a vulnerable location, we are vulnerable. If we take less vulnerable uses, still activate a building, we can preserve a building and keep it in a civic location much more effectively as Americans abroad. So this is some of the design studies of this piece that connects it. It's a singular gesture. There are many other things on this project that our team is involved in. Steve Walnut is here, and he's been leading the preservation. It also involves a very significant new building on the site that needs to scale itself to relate to the Gropius building. And all in all, it's a complex, layered process that I think takes preservation and other critical initiatives and asks, how do we deal with a building in a location and with uses and in an environment and with a kind of headset that we're all wearing about American safety or anyone's safety abroad, and rekindle its life. So I'm actually going to stop because I think you need to lead the band here, and there's been a lot out here. So we could talk about Lucan, but you all know about Lucan. It's good. We're working on the Exeter Library. Go ahead,
Okay,
Mark.
great. Well,
do you want to
thanks.
change this
I
slide
think
and
they'll take care
play
of it.
with it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do want to give time also for people to ask questions from the audience. So I'm only going to ask one question, but it's going to be multi-layered. That way you guys can respond to it in a couple of different ways. But in listening to your presentations, I'm struck by many of the complicated dualities that exist in modern preservation. David, you talked about preserving an idea versus technical challenges, right? That's a quite sweeping range of thoughts that you might have. Henry, you spoke about the relationship between modern optimism from the time and the public-wide dislike of that work today. And you talked about concepts of patrimony, which seem fixed, as well as change in buildings, life, as well as changes in us. And so these are kind of radical, almost dialectical positions that exist within the preservation of modernism in particular, maybe in ways that don't exist to the same degree in other types of preservation. So my question to you is, in light of this kind of radicality, how is preservation itself changing to adapt to these kinds of questions? You know, if we think of preservation as, you know, a return to the past, certainly that's not the issue today. And I'm curious what you think as a discipline it's doing to change. And then also my second part of that question is, how do you convey within this kind of complex environment the value of these types of buildings to the public and to clients? I told you it'd be multi-layered.
I'll start since it's been, I haven't spoken for the longest time. But there's a lot to address. I think to your first thing about how preservation is changing, I think one of the fundamental and positive aspects of the way that preservation is changing is it is so often seen, I mean, I think the notion of a preservation restriction says it all. The idea that preservation restricts. That's not what it should be. What it should be is that preservation gives you the opportunity to reveal things and to use them, and much the way that Anne was talking about, to buttress what you need to do to move something forward into today and into the future, to sort of make it part of the living continuity of history, which includes the relevance of our culture today and the anticipation of what culture will be in the future. And I think that if we see it much more that way, then you can start to bring in all of these other, the technical and the business about the, preserving the idea and all that. It all has a lot more relevance because you're dealing with something that is living rather than something that is quote unquote preserved. And I think that that's a sort of fundamental first step that you've got to get at. And I think in particular with modern buildings, as I mentioned, the fact that they are in many ways, there's a very interesting conundrum because on the one hand we're very close to them. Most of the people in this room grew up with modern architecture the way that I did and the way that a lot of us did. And it is something that is still very tangible, and yet it is history at the same time. We are in a different world. It is not the same as it was 50 years ago or even 40 years ago. But bringing that all together in a meaningful way where you can understand the difference, as Henry talked about in his lobby at BU, and it's certainly something that all of us face in our work, parsing the business of language that I mentioned, is extremely important. But I think that the idea is that you want to create a more vibrant whole today. You want to, rather than a series of fragments, you want to be able to bring that together into something that speaks to the relevance of today by building upon what was there in the past and what should be remembered and honored and brought forward into the future.
I have a slightly different way of saying similar things, and I'll make it more personal. What I really like about working with these buildings that people hate so much, I'm serious, is that there's an existential encounter with something that's actual. People look at concrete that they hate and they respond to it. And the situation is a kind, from my point of view, is a kind of mental and emotional cleansing of the nostalgic haze through which the past is typically seen. And from my point of view also, there was a fear that the political basis that fueled preservation, which had grown out of a reaction against urban renewal and so forth, would disappear when we got to the buildings that drove people into that hallucinatory past where there were no cars, where everybody was comfortable, where all of the sectional conflicts within the society could be kind of disregarded. Didn't matter if you had slaves, you had a portico. All of those issues just get shouldered aside by the buildings themselves. And the fact that there's so many stakeholders at BU, those buildings are owned by the administration of the university. The department, the law school, lives in the building and is in charge of its life. The next group of stakeholders are the people who use the building, who wait for the elevators for 20 minutes trying to go from one class to the next. And then a fourth group of stakeholders are people like us who say, be careful how you mess with that building. We care about it. All of those are, it's not just two pieces of polarities in the spectrum. There are all of those four that are mixed in there. But the actuality, the physicality, and the initial dislike of the buildings, I think, adds energy to the whole process, and I welcome that.
Well, I think buildings have a responsibility to serve our community. And when buildings really cannot do that for any variety of reasons, I think they need to be questioned. But I never ask people I never try to convince people to like a building. I just try to convince them to consider it. And I think that issue of consideration is helped by the kind of story that you told about Sert, things I didn't know about Sert, the kind of way, David, that you can demonstrate that certain buildings like the UN were meant to mean things, and that you've said around the Coleman McKinnell work at City Hall, that it had a democratic intention that may not be instantly recognizable. Like, you know, I didn't know that about that. And I think when you consider things, when you try to broaden the discussion, then there's the possibility of people contributing to how we look at these structures. I think I have one other comment, which is I do not think that all preservation advocates are moving at the same intellectual pace as me. And I think that there is a time that I can imagine that the word preservation is probably not used much, because it simply pours itself into the world of responsible design. The way the word sustainability is used a little less than it might have even been used 5 years ago. It's just poured itself into the way one works to consider what is in addition to what could be. And for me, the hard part is not convincing people to love a building, it's convincing them that change is part of our own history, and that adapting and changing a building is a way of moving preservation forward.